Welcome to Bada Boom. I'm Chris. On this episode of the podcast, Mark Russell returns, this time to talk Rumpus Room, a story that follows an eccentric tech billionaire who traps people in his Rumpus Room, where he turns his victims into skin cream, and the victims' only solace is they get to pick who's next. Russell discusses the real-world inspiration in his other upcoming book, Cereal, which follows breakfast cereal monsters in what is described as What We Do in the Shadows meets Monster Squad. Listen in and bada boom. Hi, Mark. How you doing?
Good.
Good. I'm excited to talk to you today because you got a couple projects I'm excited for. One, Rumpus Room, and then also Cereal. I think we'll get started on Rumpus Room. It's a pretty crazy pitch, especially these days, and I think you've definitely made a name for yourself when it comes to this space of dark humor and sort of almost like political satires talking about sort of the people that really run this world. So where did this start? I know you have a really good relationship with AWA, but where did the pitch come from?
Well, I like to start with some sort of parable, some sort of story that's more than just the plot, but speaks to what I see as like being a stand-in for another social issue. So the story is about a billionaire who locks people in his rumpus room and one by one has them crushed into skin cream, but he allows them to vote on the next person to be crushed. So to me, I thought, well, this is like a really great sort of parable when I came up with the idea for American democracy, how we're allowed to like vote within the confines that the billionaire class allows us to, and that usually constitutes voting on who of our other fellow Americans we're going to throw under the bus, who is less human than we are. And so I wanted to use that as a parable to talk about sort of the problems with American civilization. But from there, I just kept getting more and more ideas of things to throw in there. And that's kind of when I know that I'm onto something, when the parable turns into a story, when I might have this idea that stands for this great sort of social issue that I want to talk about, but then the characters come to life and just sort of take over the story. And I think that's when you've got a series on your hands.
That's awesome. And then with AWA, like, did you pitch them on the artist, or was it something that like evolved through like several edits? Like, what did that look like?
Well, AWA has an impressive stable of artists. So they just Ramon is a great artist. He's been doing a lot of stuff for AWA. So they just pulled him out of the quiver and paired him with this project, which I'd seen his artwork before and really liked it, and I thought, yeah, he'd be ideal for this. So they really are the ones that matched me with Ramon for this project.
Yeah, and in terms of like what you see it as, obviously you have that story written out. Do you see it going past that initial arc?
It could. It ends in a kind of open-ended way. So we could potentially do a number 2, but I don't currently have any plans to do a follow-up.
Yeah. And for you, like
Not All Robots, actually, which I also do anyway. The door is open for a sequel, but I think it stands on its own too.
Yeah, that's good. I think for you, like, how fun is it to kind of, really engage with, sort of the political climate through your stories? I'm sure that's a really good way to kind of let some of that out, as frustrating as the world can be sometimes these days. And I think for you, like, what's great as a reader, for me, like reading your stories, is seeing how, your worldview, but also sort of you're able to, yes, obviously you're an artist and you have an opinion, and there's obviously anyone that writes something is always going to have like an inherent bias, but you're able to give someone this story and still be able to take something away no matter where you stand in terms of these political issues. So for you, like, how fun is it that like to engage in those issues like that?
Well, I think the key is to turn into a parable, turn into a story that's something other than what you're really talking about. And that way, one, people are not really defensive about it. They don't feel like they're being attacked or preached to. But on the other hand, for you as a writer, it's a lot of fun because then you get to like sort of it's a writing prompt. So then you get to like think about how the characters fit in or don't fit in with this narrative. or what sort of side issues will come up. And that to me, that's where the fun really starts, is when I start going beyond the initial parable. I just start thinking of like how these characters would sort of bump into each other, and how they would, which ones would like or dislike the other ones, and who gets betrayed and why.
Yeah. No, and for like reading sort of the synopsis and talking to you, it's interesting because again, it's not hard to draw like too many parallels like to the real world, especially like you said, it almost seems like we're always kind of kicking the can to the next person. It's like, okay, like I'm screwed, but you guys will be screwed more down the line. You know what I mean?
Right.
It
Yeah, I think
goes,
that's kind of what it seems to be, a real galvanizing political reality. It's like,
mm,
well, I'm not going to help you at all, but if you vote for me, I'll make sure the people you don't like suffer even more. And I think that's a winning political message in today's political climate, which is what I wanted to really talk
yeah,
about. How we've somehow been convinced to think of politics as not like improving society, but as like a tool for making it worse for the people we don't care about, which is, probably going to be what destroys us all.
yeah. It's becoming more and more like a wrestling promotion.
Yeah, right. People, I think, root for uh, people are really partisan, and like cult like, especially I'm going to single them out, like the
Mm,
Trump people.
mm,
They tend to think. I think the reason why they're able to like throw so much of their identity into it is because they've come to think of politics as like college football,
mm,
where
yeah,
it's just like, well, it's my team against your team, and I don't really care what the issues are. I don't really care, what this means for me. I just want my team to win at all costs, and it doesn't really matter if I lose too, or if the victory doesn't really bring me any joy or better my life at all. I just want you to lose.
yeah. It's all about winning. But speaking of kind of like the funness, like another thing that you got coming is cereal. And for me, whenever you put sort of in the byline like what we do in the shadows meets, Monster Squad, I'm like, all right, that's a immediate pre-order. So where did that come from, and what was it like creating that pitch for Ahoy?
Well, some stories like Rumpus Room are deductive, where you start with a big idea and then you go down to like more granular sort of
Mm,
ideas. Other stories are inductive, where
mm,
it's like you start with a few small ideas, like characters talking to each other, or just a conversation, and then it broadens up into this big story. And that's kind of what Serial was. It was more inductive, where I just was writing these little dialogues between Captain Crunch and Frankenberry, or Count Chocula
mm.
and his wife, like on Facebook, and people liked them and would comment on them, and I just sort of saved them. And then at some point I realized that if I stitched these together, there's actually the kernel of a story there. So when they were doing the Edgar Allan Poe Snifter of Terror series for at Ahoy, where there are these sort of Edgar Allan Poe inspired stories, they asked me if I had anything, and I remembered this sort of funny but horrifying Count Chocula thing I'd written. So I said, "Yeah, I got this." So I wrote them like a 10-page story about uh, how Count Chocula and his wife became vampires, and about what a nightmare that would be to be somebody who is known for their breakfasts and to become a vampire. It's like you of all the meals you have to be awake for as a vampire. Um, so I sent that in and I liked it. So then we started talking about doing more of them. So I had to start thinking of the story in broader
Mm.
terms, like bringing more characters in, building it more into a unified narrative, and then it's just sort of snowballed into this graphic novel length epic.
Yeah, and being that it's epic and it's a graphic novel form, like what's that process like versus, writing something like a mini series or an ongoing?
Well, I actually like releasing it just as a graphic novel, because my complaint with like doing something in a series form is that people only get to read, one like 20% of it at a time. Which, imagine watching a movie that way. Imagine
Yeah.
showing up and seeing 20 minutes of a movie and then having to leave for a month. then coming back and seeing
Yeah.
another 20 minutes. I mean, I understand that's what comics are,
Yeah.
but at the same time, if I have the opportunity to release it all together as a book, I prefer to do it that way, so you can just immerse yourself and read the whole story at once.
Yeah. And does that like change your approach? Because obviously in sort of series format, you kind of always have, there's always that first issue like cliffhanger, and you kind of have to figure
Yeah.
out ways to keep people engaged, so that they don't forget in a month to pick up that next issue. So like what's the approach like, when you get that green light to write something like in a serial where it's a full graphic novel form?
Yeah, it does change things. I'd like to say it doesn't, that,
Mm,
that I'm above all that,
yeah.
and that I, just write a story from beginning to end the way I want it to be. But the truth is that when you are writing, 20 or 22 page, monthly comics, you do sort of think about like, well, where's a good ending point for this? How do I, get people to, how do I inspire people at the end to pick up the next one? And I think this has resulted in a lot of schlocky writing where you just sort of like see characters talking or treading water for 20 pages, and then there's a splash page at the end with some major, plot twist or
Yeah.
reveal to get you to show up to buy, to waste $4 on the next comic.
Mm,
And I always feel like that's sort of gimmicky and trite. And so I don't like having to use those devices. But at the same time, when you're writing episodic fiction like that, it's good to think of it in terms of like, well, what's this episode about? Or what's the next episode going to be about?
mm,
And try to give each issue a theme and try to give each issue like a focus, and to think of them in terms of independent stories, individual stories within a greater narrative. So I think it really does sort of help to think of a story in these sort of chapter by chapter terms. I just think you can't let that be a crutch and make you a lazy writer who just relies upon making the end of the chapter sort of good or, explosive, and not worrying about the rest of the writing. So I think it's okay. And in fact, it helps to think in this sort of episodic chapter by chapter basis if you're doing the hard work along the way.
yeah, and it is hard work. And, kind of going back to a series you wrote, which is like Superman Space Age, me as a reader, I really appreciated how those three, books and issues really stood on their own. And there was that larger arc and narrative that all came together at the end. Yeah, there were like little things like, the Justice League in the background to keep you interested in
Yeah.
stuff. But I think you do a really good job of keeping the reader engaged and playing, okay, like this issue is particular about this theme. And I think it works really well collected, which it is now, and then also in those, if you're collecting it monthly, it was a great read.
Thank you very much.
Mm.
And it helped that those were 80 pages long.
Oh
So
yeah, yeah.
they were like little, like mini books.
Yeah.
And also, my writing philosophy, I think, is that like whatever happens on, page 27 is as important as what happens on page one or happens on page 80. And so if you write with that philosophy that I am saying, I am telling the reader the most important thing I have to say to them at that moment, and that's true of wherever you are in the story, it'll be good regardless of whether, I mean, they will come back for the second volume whether or not you end on some cliffhanger or something.
Yeah, and for you, again, you've had like a really, successful career, and now that you're in this place where you have this really good relationship with AWA and sort of done some bigger books like Superman Space Age, do you find yourself in a space where you could kind of be more selective in terms of like what's offered to you or what you pitch on?
Yeah, I find that it's allowed me to like pull a lot of the ideas I had out of the drawer for creator owned titles, or ideas that, I don't know who's going to buy this comic,
Yeah,
but somebody will take a chance on printing it,
yeah,
which is nice because I feel like the stories I want to tell a lot of times aren't necessarily the most obviously commercial
mm,
ones, but then those tend to be the ones that pan out. Um, Not All Robots was a pitch that nobody seemed to want. It got rejected everywhere, but it's like one of my most successful titles. So I think that you have to. It's hard for somebody listening to a pitch to think
Mhm.
about a story and how good it's going to be or not good it's going to be based upon anything other than the elevator pitch. So they really have to be sort of convinced not by the tagline of the story or your hook. They have to be convinced more by their own faith in your ability to pull it off. And I think that's the thing that having, multiple good titles to your name gives you that credibility where this story might not make a lot of sense or they might not have a lot of faith that anybody's going to buy this book
Mhm.
based upon your description of it, but they do have faith in you as a writer to somehow make it worthwhile.
Yeah, and in terms of like your work with the big two, you had Space Age, you had a Blade one shot. Is there anything coming up that like you're really excited about that is something in those lines, or maybe something a little bit different?
I have one big two project going on right now, which I can't really talk about because
Mhm.
it hasn't been announced, but I'm super excited for it and I can't wait to talk about it.
Oh, that's for me, that's awesome. Like I said, Superman Space Age was one of my favorites. And then we got to talk about Blade last time, and I'm really excited for Serial and Rumpus Room. But again, like what's it like? It seems like you're able to juggle all these like really weighty titles as well. Like which I'm sure is difficult, but like I said, as a reader, it feels like you're having a lot of fun engaging in these conversations, about bigger themes and bigger issues. So what's that like, sort of having multiple things at the same time? I'm sure for me, like I almost have like a one track mind. I have to work on like one thing at a time. But as a writer, like what's it like to sort of juggle all these really big things and make sure that they're different enough, you know what I mean? You don't want someone
Right.
to kind of like read like, oh, like they're gonna get the same exact thing they got in No Not All Robots in Rumpus Room and stuff. So like how do you sort of make sure that you're keeping those things a little bit separate?
Well, for me, it really helps if I'm working on several things at once, and it also really helps if they're very different, like
Mhm.
different genres or different tonalities, because my brain will relax if I'm writing like a superhero story and I get like just sort of in a corner or I feel tired, sick of it. If I'm then working on like a story about a silent film star or something set in history, the superhero part of my brain can relax for a while,
Yeah.
can unknot all of the corners I've painted myself to do on the superhero story while I'm working on that other thing. And then when I get sick of that, I can go back to the superhero story and it, it's like rotating your crops.
Yeah. No, that's great, and again, like doing the podcast, it's been interesting to see what, people's creative process are because I'm always fascinated, especially in comics, because you juggle so many different things, In movie and TV, you may work on one thing for 2 years, but
Right.
if you're, a working comic writer or artist, you have these very different things at different publishers, and you're constantly pitching things and always kind of going for the next thing, and some of
Yeah.
these ideas are really big, so it's always interesting to see how creators tackle that issue.
Yeah. I find that it's a lot easier for me to write four completely different titles at once than it would be to say like write four Justice League titles at the same time.
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm sure, and especially these days. But again, I think you've been able to find sort of to make those things interesting. In a world where there's a bunch of Superman books, you're able to kind of make something like Space Age that's very different, and I think will in years to come, people will go back to it and see it in a really good light, along with some really great stories. And again, that's why it's so great to talk to you because when I read those things, I'm like, oh my God, like what was he thinking when he was writing this? But in terms of like, before we got on, you were talking about sort of, being excited about the con circuit. What's it been like sort of we had a couple of years where we weren't able to interact in person, but what's it been like to, after all the success of, Not All Robots and some of your other books, what's it been like sort of interacting with fans?
It's been great. I have to say I was getting a little burned out on the
Mm,
con circuit before COVID-19, and
mm,
then when that hit, I didn't have the cons for a couple of years. I realized that I kind of missed it, and I missed it precisely for that reason,
mm,
being able to interact with fans or talk to somebody who really, your work meant something to them is something you don't, it's like you don't get a lot as a writer. And so when you do get it, you really have to sort of treasure it. It's not like being a singer or an actor where you get immediate response
Mm,
from your performance on stage. Being a writer, you put you send out a story, and God knows if anyone's even reading it.
yeah.
Like you're a prisoner, or you're on a desert island throwing bottles with notes in it into the water, and you never hear back from anyone. So the cons are sort of my chance to actually hear back from people, and I always find it really gratifying. I get sick of like a lot of the I get sick of the travel sometimes. I get sick of the I can only eat so many turkey wraps, but other than that, I really enjoy going to conventions and talking to people. Plus, I've become friends with a lot of other comic creators, and for a lot of them, these are the only time I see those people.
Yeah, I think especially these days, there's so many creators that are, on other sides of the world. You were talking about going to Brazil, and Mike Diodado's from Brazil, so I'm sure
Now,
that's
no, we're
interesting.
playing. I've never met him person
Okay.
to person, so this will be like a great. I think I'm really looking forward to meeting Mike for the first time.
That's awesome. Again, especially being that you created something that has had such an impact together to kind of be able to finally meet, it's always like a beautiful thing. Like, especially, being in New York, I'm really lucky. New York Comic Con, there's a lot of people that are from across the world that are able to come in that one space. So it's always good to see, again, all those creators in one place, because it is such a unique thing, and it's easy to kind of take it for granted. But then, even me as an attendee, I was like, I don't know if I really want to do these anymore and stuff. And then they were gone, and I was like, there's a little hole that I don't quite know what's missing. And then going back was such a good fun a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I came back, I remembered all the. It was like going to my first convention again. It's like, oh, you forget how much fun you can have just sort of talking to people and looking at what people are creating and stuff. I needed that reminder.
Yeah, and for me, it was great. It was the first time I could walk around New York Comic Con for a while. I was like, oh, like the first year they came back, I was like, I could do a cartwheel in this hall right now. This is awesome. This reminds me of my first con. But yeah, it's great to kind of be in a space, and as sometimes you could get tired of things, it is great to kind of be reminded of like what that enthusiasm's like in person, and what it's like to have so many people that have a passion about something in one place.
Absolutely.
But yeah, thank you, Mark. It's been awesome. I'm really excited to read both Rumpus Room and Serial. Is there anything else you want to let the people know you're working on that's possibly announced that you'd like to share?
Yeah, we're finishing up the third series on Second Coming, which I consider to be sort of my flagship title.
Mm.
As much work into that as anything I do. And so look for the trade paperback should be coming out soon. And then Serial comes out October 10th.
And then you be at New York Comic Con and a couple cons this year as well, right?
I'll be at New York Comic Con in October. Hopefully I'll have my copies of Serial then. I can give them out to people.
Awesome, awesome. I'll definitely be there. But thank you. And with that, bada boom.
Bada boom.
Thank you for listening to the Bob Boom Podcast. Keep the conversation going with Chris and I on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. You can find us on all these places at Bob Boom Podcast. Get into the comments on our YouTube channel. Let us know what you like about the show or what you'd like to hear from us in the future. Until next time, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Thanks for listening.